I froze mid-bite, the fork heavy in my hand, as my own son sneered across the table. "Stop eating like you own this place." The words sliced sharper than any knife, echoing through the kitchen I had built with my bare hands. For a moment, shame burned hotter than the coffee in my cup. But that shame turned to steel the next morning, when the mortgage statement landed in my mailbox, and his lies began to unravel. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The kitchen smelled of coffee and butter, sunlight spilling across the oak table that had hosted 1,000 family breakfasts. But this morning the warmth felt brittle, like a glass about to crack. Pat sat at the head of the table, posture upright, trying to hold on to her role as matriarch, though her knuckles whitened around the mug and she had cooked the eggs, buttered the toast, poured the coffee. She had done it all, the way she always had. But something about the silence from her family told her that nothing about this meal was. Diana, her daughter-in-law, pushed scrambled eggs around her plate with a fork, not bothering to lift a bite to her lips. A dry chuckle escaped her throat, as if the whole scene, the china plates, the folded napkins, Pat's careful effort, were some kind of inside joke. She leaned back in her chair, eyes sparkling with a private amusement. Pat tried not to stare, tried not to let her hands tremble. "Is something funny?" she asked, voice measured. Diana tilted her head, lips curling. "Nothing you'd understand." The words hit harder than Pat expected, a sting wrapped in velvet. At the other end of the table, Emily, Pat's daughter, lowered her gaze to her plate. Her fork hovered in midair, then rested on the porcelain with a soft clink. Emily's expression wasn't cruel. No, it was worse. It was pity. Shame and sympathy mixed in her eyes, as if she couldn't decide which was heavier to carry. She avoided her mother's gaze, the way someone avoids eye contact with a wounded animal. The air tightened. Pat felt her throat constrict but forced herself to swallow. Mark, her eldest, broke the silence with a smirk. He had his father's sharp jaw, his father's dismissive "Mom," he said, leaning back in his chair like he owned the room. "Times have changed. You don't run things. Maybe it's time you let go." The words landed like a slap across the table. Pat's hand twitched toward the butter knife, not in violence, but as if she needed something solid to grip. Her son's word, the boy she had raised, the man she had fed, clothed, sacrificed, cut deeper than anything Dana could ever mutter. Her chest tightened, but she kept her lips pressed into a thin line. No scene, not here, not at her own breakfast table. She would not give them the pleasure of seeing her unravel. Instead, she lowered her gaze, lifted her coffee, and swallowed the bitter taste. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting match could have been. When the meal ended, chairs scraped, dishes clinked, and laughter, light, careless laughter, floated from the others as they left her sitting alone at the table. The yolks had hardened, untouched. The napkins lay crumpled, discarded. Pat stayed seated, eyes on the faint scratches, traces of decades of family meals. Each mark told a story. Birthday candle, Thanksgiving argument, Christmas morning, and now this. Her humiliation carved, invisible but permanent. She rose slowly, gathered the plates with deliberate care, and washed them one by one. Each dish clinked softly in the sink, like a muted tolling bell. That evening, after the house fell into its usual hush, Pat sat alone in her study. The desk lamp glowed warm against the stack of old file folders spread before her, papers she hadn't touched in years, documents tucked away like forgotten weapons. She ran her fingers over yellowed pages, property deeds, investment notes, a ledger that most of her family probably thought was dust by now. Her heart beat steady, no longer frantic with humiliation. Each paper reminded her of who she was, not a relic, not an afterthought, but the woman who had built everything these ungrateful mouths fed upon. She leaned closer, the lamplight catching the steel in her eyes. A whisper slipped into the quiet room, barely audible but sharp as glass. "I know exactly what." The words hung in the air like a promise, or a threat. The next morning brought no peace. The mail lay scattered on the counter, mostly junk, credit card offers, catalogs, a reminder for a dentist appointment. Pat sifted through the pile mechanically, her fingers paused on a stark white envelope from the bank. It was addressed to Mark and Patricia Holloway. Her breath snagged at the sight of her full name, printed bold and official. She slid a finger under the flap, tearing carefully, as though the paper itself carried weight. The statement unfolded in her, rows of numbers neat and merciful. Her eyes landed on the bold line, past due balance. The figures blurred for a second before sharpening again, undeniable. Her son, so smug, so sure of himself, hadn't been making payments. Not consistently, not for months. A slow pulse throbbed in her. The house, the very one she and her late husband had poured their lives into, was sitting under delinquency. She lowered herself into a chair, the statement trembling slightly between her fingers. Each digit on the page screamed louder than the laughter from yesterday's breakfast. Mark, who claimed times have changed. Mark, who smirked at her like she was some relic to be set aside. He was rotting the foundation from beneath their feet. Her hand reached for the phone almost of its own accord. She dialed the familiar number, a voice she hadn't heard in years answering after 2 rings. Robert Lane, First American Bank. Robert, it's Patricia Holloway, she said, steady but low. There was a pause, just a beat, but she could hear recognition thread through. Mrs. Holloway, been a long time. What can I do for you? She glanced again at the statement, jaw tightening. I need clarification about a mortgage tied to my property, the Holloway residence. Shuffling papers on the other end, a muted click of keys. Yes, I have it here. You're listed as a co-owner of your son, Mark Holloway. The words steadied her spine. Still listed, still hers. And the account status? She pressed. Another pause, heavier this time. It's delinquent. Several payments missed. Notices have gone out. His tone softened, almost apologetic. Your son attempted to refinance earlier this year, didn't go through, lacked the necessary co-signature. Yours. Pat felt her lips curve, not in humor but in something colder, something that hummed beneath her. Mark had tried to edge her out, quietly, arrogantly, and the system had reminded her, that she wasn't gone. Not yet. Thank you, Robert, she said crisply. That's all I need. She replaced the receiver, the click sounding like a gavel closing on a verdict. Behind her, the faintest creak. Emily stood in the doorway barefoot, arms folded across her chest. Her expression was wide-eyed, as though she had stumbled into a confession. Mom? Emily's voice was uncertain. What? What was that about? Pat folded the statement neatly, sliding it back into its envelope. She took her time, every motion deliberate, before lifting her gaze to her daughter. You heard enough, she said, tone calm but edged. Emily shifted, tucking a strand of hair behind her. Mark, he didn't tell us. None of us knew. The shame in her voice was genuine, unguarded. Pat stood, the envelope in her hand now feeling less like paper and more like a weapon. She stepped past her daughter toward the study where the files still waited under the lamplight. They think I'm fading, she whispered. Not to Emily, not to anyone but herself. The words unfurled like smoke, curling in the silence. She let them linger before finishing, sharper, iron under silk. I'm awake. The house seemed to absorb the sentence, the walls themselves holding it close, as if recognizing a change in weather. And in the dim light of the hall, Pat's shadow stretched long and certain, no longer the outline of a woman humiliated, but of one sharpening her knives in silence. The bank's lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant, sterile in the way only financial ins could be. Pat hadn't set foot inside in years, but the marble floor and muted gray walls felt the same, calculated to make visitors feel small beneath the weight of numbers. She clutched her handbag tight against her side as she approached the reception desk. Mrs. Holloway? Robert Lane's voice carried across the room. He was older now, hair thinning, glasses perched low on his nose, but his stride still carried the confidence of a man who had seen 1,000 people try to talk their way around debt. He extended his hand. Robert, Pat said, her grip firm. Thank you for seeing me so quickly. He gestured toward his office, a glass-walled box tucked away in the corner. The blinds were half closed, offering just enough privacy. Pat followed, her heels tapping out a slow, deliberate rhythm. Once inside, Robert pulled a folder from his desk drawer, its cover stamped with the bank's insignia. He laid it flat before her, sliding it across the polished wood. Pat opened it, her eyes moving over the first page. Her breath tightened. There, in black ink, was her name, Patricia Holloway. Neat, perfectly spelled, and completely, unmistakably not her. Her signature, forged. The slant was wrong, the loop of the P too sharp, the H a stiff imitation of her natural flourish. She had signed thousands of documents in her life, and none of them had looked like this stiff, practiced scrawl. Robert leaned forward, voice low. Your son submitted this during the refinance. He listed himself as the sole responsible party, claimed you'd signed to release in. Pat ran her finger lightly along the page, not quite touching the ink. Her stomach churned. He thought I wouldn't notice, she whispered. Robert's expression hardened. It's fraud. Plain and simple. You'd have grounds for serious legal action. The word fraud echoed in her ears, louder than any church bell. Fraud wasn't just betrayal. It was a weapon she could turn. Her throat was dry, but she managed to ask, "Do I get copies?" Robert nodded. "I'll make sure of it." The whir of the scanner filled the room as he began feeding pages in. Line after line of damning proof slid under the glass. Behind him, movement caught Pat's eye. Emily stood outside the glass wall, hesitant, arms wrapped around her. When Robert stepped away, Pat rose and opened the office door. "Come in," she said softly. Emily obeyed, her gaze darting between her mother and the papers spread across the desk. "Is that—" Pat's jaw tightened. "Your brother forged my name." Emily's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked at the papers as though they were evidence of a crime scene, and they were. "Sit," Pat instructed. "You're going to—" Emily took Robert's place at the scanner. Her hands trembled at first, fumbling with the pages, but soon her movements steadied, feeding each sheet carefully into the machine, saving digital copies that couldn't be erased or altered. Pat collected the original, smoothing each one before sliding them into a leather binder she had brought with her. The binder snapped shut with a decisive click, heavy in her hand. For a long moment she looked down at it, feeling the shift inside her, the change from victim to strategist. Her humiliation at the breakfast table had been fuel. This was fire. She closed the binder, holding it against her chest. A whisper escaped her, quiet but burning with intent. "They forged my—" She lifted her gaze, eyes narrowing with— "I'll write theirs in court." The words didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like inevitability. And as Robert returned, handing her a second envelope filled with certified copies, Pat felt the first true weight of power settle back into. The Holloway kitchen felt colder now, though the September sun streamed through the windows. Pat stood at the counter, binder tucked under her arm, when Diana strolled in, her perfume arriving a half-second before. Diana's smirk was sharp enough to slice the— Her eyes flicked to the leather binder like a predator tracking prey. "Carrying papers around like shield?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "That won't save you, Pat. Ink dries. Judges don't care about ghosts clinging to signatures." Pat didn't flinch. She placed the binder carefully on the table, the sound deliberate, a quiet declaration of its weight. Before she could answer, heavy footsteps filled the doorway. Mark entered, shoulders squared, jaw set. He looked less like her son and more like a man rehearsing dominance. His gaze landed on the binder, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Enough games, Mom," he said. He pulled a folded document from his pocket and slapped it on the table. "Sign the power of attorney. Today. We're not dragging this circus through court." The page stared up at her, blank signature line waiting like a trap. Pat's fingers itched, but she didn't reach for a pen. Instead, she lifted her chin. "Or else?" Mark's jaw twitched. "Don't test me." His voice dropped lower, heavy with threat. "You'll regret it if you make me your enemy." A beat of silence passed. Then, a faint click. Emily stood just beyond the doorway, phone in hand, recording. Her breath was shallow, her thumb steady on the— She said nothing, but her eyes darted to her mother, wide and silently pleading for— Hold firm. Pat's gaze flicked to Emily, then back to Mark. She sat down at the table, calm as stone, folding her hands over the unopened binder. "I won't sign," she said evenly. The words hung between them like a blade. Mark exhaled sharply through his nose, snatched up the paper, and shoved it back into his pocket. His glare lingered for a final beat before he turned and stormed out. Diana followed, her heels tapping an angry rhythm across the floor. The house fell silent again, broken only by Emily's trembling exhale as she stopped the recording. She approached the table, her phone still warm in her— "That's evident," she whispered, almost as if trying to convince herself. Pat gave a single nod. "It is." Later that afternoon, Pat sat across from a polished mahogany desk in an office lined with law books. Sunlight cut across the room, catching on the silver frames. Lisa Porter leaned forward, her suit jacket crisp, her presence sharp as a blade. Pat slid the binder and the envelope of certified copies across the desk. Emily, beside her, placed the phone down, screen dark but heavy with what it carried. Lisa flipped through the document, pausing on the forged signature. Her expression never wavered until she set the page leaned back. "This isn't family drama," Lisa said, her tone decisive. "It's fraud. Clear, deliberate, prosecutable fraud." Pat felt the words sink into her bone, heavier than any insult her family had thrown. Fraud. Not personal weakness, not old age. A crime. She nodded slowly, the binder steady beneath her. Then we fight it as fraud. Lisa's eyes narrowed, a flicker of approval crossing her face. Good. But be ready. When people commit fraud against family, they don't fold quietly. They'll fight dirtier than you expect. Pat straightened her shoulders, every line of her body iron strong. So will I. The room stilled, the gravity of the moment thick. Outside the office window, a siren wailed fading down the street like an omen. Pat glanced at her daughter, then back to the lawyer. Her humiliation was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, and alive. And though she didn't speak it aloud, she knew. The war had just begun. The conference room smelled of fresh toner and stale coffee, its long table scattered with manila folders and stacks of photocopied statements. Pat sat at the head of the table, binder in front of her like a general with her map. Emily sat to her right, shoulders squared but nervous, while Lisa paced with the controlled energy of a litigator warming up for trial. At the far end, Quinn Rivera adjusted his tie. The young investigator had the crisp confidence of someone who'd seen too many scams unravel in ugly. He opened a laptop, the screen casting a pale light across his face. Mrs. Holloway, he began, we've run a sweep across your credit history. What we found goes beyond a single refinance attempt. Pat leaned forward, her stomach tightened, but her expression stayed Go on. Quinn tapped a key. The projector lit up the wall. A chart of accounts, balances, dates, multiple lines of credit, he said, his voice steady, professional. Opened in your name, none of them authorized by you, charges totaling over $30,000. The room seemed to tilt. Emily covered her mouth, eyes wide. Pat forced herself to keep breathing, steady and deliberate, even as rage burned beneath her. Lisa stepped closer to the screen. Who's tied to the activity? Quinn scrolled. Transactions traced back to accounts linked to Mark Holloway. Several purchases made with cards tied to Diana Holloway as an authorized user. Diana. Her laugh at the breakfast came rushing back, that careless cruelty now stained with something darker. Complicity. Pat pressed her palm flat against the binder. It was no longer just betrayal. It was theft, violation, an attempt to erase her by signing her name, draining her accounts, stealing her legacy. Is it enough to file? She asked, her voice quiet but threaded with steel. Lisa's gaze cut sharp. It's more than enough. She gathered the papers into a stack, tucking them into a red case file. We'll move forward with a civil fraud claim immediately. It locks down assets, forces discovery. Once the court sees this, your son and daughter-in-law will be under oath. Robert Lane entered then, carrying a folder of notarized documents. His presence felt like ballast, steady and immovable. He placed the folder before Pat. My statement, he said simply. Notarized. Copies of the original refinance, the forged signature, dates, and witnesses. Pat looked at him, gratitude flickering in her eyes. You've done more than I could have asked. He shook his head. No, I've just made sure the truth doesn't vanish. Emily reached across the table then, her hand covering Pat's. Her grip was warm, firm, not the trembling uncertainty. Her eyes glistened, but her voice carried conviction. You're stronger than them, Mom, stronger than you even realize. For the first time in weeks, Pat allowed herself a small smile. It was faint, fragile, but real. She squeezed her daughter's hand and then she looked down at the binder, its weight heavier than any stone, its contents sharper than any blade. Her whisper came low, almost conspiratorial, but it filled the room with the force of prophecy. They don't see it yet. She shut the binder with a decisive snap. They will. The hum of the projector died as Quinn closed his laptop. The room dimmed, shadows stretching long across the walls. It felt like the quiet before a storm, the kind where lightning already coils unseen in the clouds. And in that hush, Pat knew. The battle was no longer about humiliation or it was about exposure. It was about war, fought not with fists, but with paper, signatures, and law. The courtroom was paneled in dark oak, its high ceiling echoing every cough, every shuffle of paper. Pat sat at the plaintiff's table, her binder resting like a silent sentinel before her. Her posture was steady, shoulders squared, the faintest glint in her eyes betraying the storm that had carried her here. Across the aisle, Mark slouched in his chair, arms crossed, his suit jacket tugged too tight at the Diana sat beside him, poised but tense, her lips pressed in a thin line. Her eyes darted toward Pat only once, and when they did, the glare was sharp enough to cut glass. The bailiff called order, and the judge, a woman with hair pinned into a severe bun, adjusted her glasses. Case of Holloway versus Holloway, she announced. We'll begin with preliminary argument. Mark leaned forward, all faux concern and condescension. Your Honor, he began, voice dripping with indignation. This is a sad misunderstanding. My mother, Patricia, isn't well. She's too old to manage complex affairs. That's why we tried to step in. This case shouldn't be about fraud. It should be about competence. Pat felt Emily bristle beside her, but Lisa's hand brushed her daughter's wrist, steadying her. Lisa rose smoothly, the red file in hand. With respect, Your Honor, she said, her tone controlled and cutting. We anticipated this baseless claim. Here is the independent competency report, conducted just last week. She handed the document to the clerk, who passed it to the bench. The judge scanned the pages, expression unreadable. Lisa continued. It verifies Mrs. Holloway is fully capable, sharp, lucid, fit to manage her own affairs. Any suggestion otherwise is an attempt to discredit her while covering financial misconduct. Mark shifted, his jaw tightening. Lisa didn't stop. She called Robert Lane to the stand. Robert walked with deliberate steps, oath administered, his presence grounding the room. He spoke clearly, no embellishment, no hesitation. I personally reviewed the refinance application submitted by Mark Holloway. The signature attributed to Patricia Holloway was forged. She never appeared in person, never authorized the. My notarized statement and copies of the documents are in the record. Pat watched Mark's, his shoulders tightening as Robert's words stacked like bricks. Then Emily stood, phone in hand, her cheeks pale but her eyes resolute. Your Honor, I have a recording, she said, voice trembling at first, then firming with every syllable. Taken in the Holloway residence. It captures Mark threatening my mother if she didn't sign power of attorney. The judge raised a brow. Play it. The audio filled the courtroom. Mark's voice, low and venomous. Don't test me. You'll regret it if you make me your enemy. A hush fell. Every shuffle, every cough, every rustle of paper vanished. The words hung like smoke, undeniable. Mark shot upright. That's out of context, he barked, face flushing red. He turned toward the bench, arms flailing. She's twisting everything. This is family business. It doesn't belong in court. The judge's gavel cracked once, sharp. Sit down, Mr. Holloway. Her tone was ice. This court is unimpressed by tantrums. Evidence speaks louder than excuses. Mark froze, chest heaving, then slumped back into his chair. Diana's hand brushed his sleeve, but she didn't speak. Her glare, however, was volcanic, directed straight at Pat. Through it all, Pat remained motionless, her hands folded over the binder. Not smug, not shaken, just steady, as if the chaos unfolding belonged to someone else entirely. The judge set aside the report, her gaze sweeping from Mark to Pat. We will proceed to full hearing on fraud. The evidence warrants. Lisa's hand brushed Pat's shoulder, a signal of victory in this first skirmish. Emily squeezed her mother's hand under the. Pat inclined her voice low enough only they could hear. One battle down. The gavel struck again, adjourning the session. But as the courtroom emptied, Diana's stare lingered, hard and unblinking, promising retaliation. And for the first time, Pat wondered, not whether she could win, but just how far her enemies would go when the mask of family finally shattered. The blinds in Lisa Porter's office were drawn halfway, slicing the sunlight into thin bars across the conference. Papers were stacked in precise piles, each binder tab a blade in an arsenal. Pat sat at the head again, binder closed before her, posture straight. She didn't need to prove control anymore. Her calm made the room bend toward her. Across from her sat Quinn Rivera and a new face, Harold Dent, a forensic accountant with hair the color of ash and a reputation for peeling back financial lies layer by layer. His briefcase was open, its contents fanned across the statements, ledgers, color-coded spreadsheet. Harold adjusted his glasses and spoke in a tone free of drama, the kind that made his revelations all the more. Your son has accumulated over $200,000 in gambling debt, he said flatly, most of it tied to online betting accounts. He masked withdrawals by layering them through multiple credit lines. Credit lines opened under your name, Mrs. Holloway. Emily sucked in a breath, her face flushed as if the shame belonged to her, not her brother. Pat reached across and touched her wrist lightly, a signal of strength without word. Harold continued, his finger tapping a highlighted line. As for Diana, the trail is more direct. Designer purchases, travel packages, high-end jewelry, all charged to accounts linked to forged applications. Tens of thousands. Lisa leaned forward, her pen poised like a spear. So, The forged signatures didn't just secure refinancing, they funded an entire lifestyle. Exactly, Harold said. And they left a digital trail wide enough for any jury to follow. Quinn tapped his laptop, pulling up a projected timeline. Each entry glowed on the wall. Forged refinance, delinquent payment, gambling withdrawals, shopping spree, a story written in numbers. This strengthens your fraud case exponentially, Quinn said. It's not just one bad signature, it's a coordinated pattern of theft, fraud, identity, and misappropriation. Pat watched the glowing dates climb the wall. Each number was a cut, each purchase a fresh betrayal. Yet her face remained serene, her breathing measured. She had spent decades balancing ledgers, stretching dollars, building a life brick by brick. She hadn't forgotten how numbers told stories. Numbers never lied. Lisa spoke again, her tone clipped but charged. We'll compile this into a comprehensive timeline. The court won't see an aging matriarch clinging to control. They'll see victims and perpetrators, theft and intent. Emily swallowed hard, her voice breaking before it steadied. I don't understand how Mark could use your name like you didn't matter. Pat turned to her granddaughter, eyes softening for a moment. Shame belongs to the guilty, not to you. Emily blinked back tears, then straightened, her hand sliding over the binder as if claiming a piece of its weight. Then I'll stand with you. All the way. Pat let the silence settle before she finally spoke, her voice low, measured, laced with something both ancient and sharp. They thought I forgot math. Everyone turned toward her. She laid her palm on the closed binder, fingers splayed as though pressing into the grain of wood itself. But I remember every cent I saved, every figure I signed. And now, I remember every one they stole. The words carried no volume, yet they filled the room with iron certainty. Lisa gave a small nod, jotting a final note. Harold closed his briefcase, his work done. Quinn shut down his laptop, the wall going dark. But Pat stayed seated a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the empty wall where the numbers had just glowed. Her silence was no longer defensive. It was steel, forged, and sharpened. And in that silence, everyone in the room understood. The Holloway family war was no longer about humiliation or even survival. It had become about judgment. The Holloway house creaked with its usual evening sound, pipes settling, the hum of the refrigerator, wind brushing against the old shutters. Pat moved through the kitchen, methodically wiping down the counter, the leather binder resting in plain view on the table. She didn't bother hiding it any. Let them see what they feared. Diana appeared in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the hall light. She didn't smile. Instead, she stepped forward, arms folded, her heels clicking softly in the tile. You think papers make you powerful? Diana said, her voice low, controlled, each word dipped in venom. But courts are slow, and accidents are quick. You understand me? Pat paused, her cloth still in hand. She looked at Diana, not with fear, but with a calm that seemed to unnerve her daughter-in-law more than any outburst could have. Is that a threat? Diana leaned closer, her perfume overwhelming, her whisper a hiss. It's a warning. Walk away before this gets ugly. Old women don't survive wars. They get buried by them. A faint click echoed from the shadow of the doorway. Emily stood there, her phone angled discreetly, recording. Her eyes were wide, but her hand didn't tremble. For the second time, she had caught Diana and Mark in their own venom. Pat didn't break eye contact with Diana. She set the cloth down, folded her hands on the counter, and said softly, You mistake me for someone afraid to be buried. Diana froze for a beat, then scoffed, straightened, and stalked out, her heels hammering the hardwood like gunshots. Emily slipped inside, shutting the door behind her. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but when she looked at her grandmother, there was no hesitation in, I got all of it. Pat gave a single nod. Good. The next morning, Lisa Porter tapped the phone on her desk, the recording playing for Diana's words spilled out, venom, threats, unmistakable malice. Lisa stopped the playback and this strengthens everything, Lisa said. Not only fraud, but intimidation. It paints a clear picture for the court. She leaned back, lips tightening into something close to satisfaction. Quinn can file a restraining order immediately. That'll clip their wings. Quinn, already opening his laptop, nodded. I'll get it filed today. Judges don't like intimidation, especially against an elderly plaintiff. This will weigh heavily in your favor. Pat felt Emily's hand brush hers beneath it, subtle but firm. She turned to her granddaughter, saw the fierce loyalty in her eyes, and allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The moment fractured hours later when Mark stormed into the house, red-faced, the restraining order still fresh in him. He slammed the paper onto the— "You little snake!" he spat at Emily. "You did this!" Emily flinched at his rage but didn't back away. She rose from her chair, shoulders squared. "I stood by the truth," she said, her voice shaking but loud. "You threatened her. Diana threatened her. And I'm not covering for you anymore." Mark's chest heaved, his fists tightening at his sides. For a moment, Pat thought he might actually strike his own daughter. She rose from her chair, her hand gripping the backrest with quiet authority. "Enough," Pat said, her voice steady, steel cutting through the chaos. "You've already shown the court who you are. Don't show them worse." Mark's nostrils flared, but the restraint order in his hand reminded him of the limits closing in. He crumpled the paper in his fist, cursed under his breath, and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. The silence that followed was jagged, but Emily broke it by moving to her grandmother's side. She wrapped her arms around Pat, holding on tightly, her face pressed against the fabric of Pat's sweater. Pat's hand rested on Emily's back, her eyes drifting to the binder on the table. Her voice was a whisper, calm but burning with certainty. "Every threat is fuel." The words hung in the room like smoke, invisible but choking, marking the moment the Holloway War tipped into something darker, irreversible. The morning paper landed on the driveway with a flat slap that carried farther than it should have. Emily slipped outside in her slippers, glancing around as though the neighbors might already be watching. She stooped, grabbed the paper, and unrolled it with nervous hands. There it was. Local family fraud scandal. Matriarch fights back. The bold letters sprawled across the front page like a verdict. Beneath it, a photo caught Pat mid-step outside the courthouse, the leather binder clutched tight against her chest, her gaze unwavering. Not an old woman fading into irrelevance, but a figure carved from steel. Emily's throat tightened. She hurried inside, dropped the paper on the table, and watched her grandmother approach. Pat didn't reach for her reading glasses. She simply looked down, scanning the headline, the photo, the first few paragraphs. Her lips didn't move, no outward reaction. But Emily saw it, the faint narrowing of her grandmother's eyes, the breath that came deeper, steadier, like a runner finding her rhythm. By noon, the story wasn't just in the paper. The local news had picked it up, anchors repeating phrases like forged signatures and family betrayal with practiced solemnity. Neighbors whispered on porches. Shoppers in the grocery checkout leaned close to gossip. For decades, Pat Holloway had been known as the widow on Maple Drive who baked pies for church sales and kept her hedges. Now she was something else entirely, the woman who refused to be erased. That afternoon, as Pat stepped onto her porch to water the geranium, Mrs. Caldwell crossed the street, her steps brisk for someone her age. She clutched Pat's hand with surprising strength. "Good for you," she said, her voice sharp with approval. "Standing up to them takes guts. Not many would." Before Pat could respond, Mr. Harris, broad-shouldered, retired firefighter, joined them. "We've all seen Mark's temper," he muttered, shaking his head. "About time someone held him accountable. Don't you back down, Pat." Pat offered a polite nod, nothing more. But inside, something shifted. This wasn't only her fight anymore. The community's eyes were on her, and their judgment was cutting into Mark and Diana as surely as any guess. Across town, Mark sat in his gray cubicle, blinds drawn, screen glowing with unfinished spreadsheet. His phone buzzed relentlessly with texts he ignored. A coworker leaned over the partition smirking. "Hey, Holloway, didn't know you were famous. Your mom's suing you, huh?" Brutal. Mark's jaw locked. He slammed his keyboard harder than he meant to, keys rattling under his fists. Heat climbed his neck. He muttered curses, but he knew the truth. His carefully built image was unraveling. Not in private, not in whisper, in headline. Back at the house, Diana didn't bother leaving her bedroom. The blinds were pulled tight, her phone buried in a drawer that still buzzed faintly with unanswered calls. At first, her friends' messages were curious. "Is it true?" Then sharper. "Why didn't you tell us?" By evening, they were crueler still. "So you've been living off her name?" Diana lay rigid in bed, staring at the ceiling, rage boiling into humiliation. For a woman who fed on appearances, invisibility was poison. Emily saw it all. The cracks spreading in her father's pride, the collapse of Diana's social armor, and for the first time, she didn't feel small in that house. She felt tall, protective, proud. Walking beside her grandmother to the car, she squared her shoulder, daring anyone in the neighborhood to whisper, Later, in Lisa Porter's office, the team gathered again. Lisa dropped the day's newspaper onto the conference. The photo of Pat glared up at them, her binder stark against the courthouse steps. "This," Lisa said, tapping the headline with her pen, "only helps us. Judges are human. They see these stories. Public shame strengthens the bench. Mark and Diana's credibility is already eroded. It sets the stage before they even." Pat leaned forward, fingers brushing the edge of the photo. Her expression didn't waver, but her words cut with clarity. "Shame is seasoning." She lifted her gaze, eyes like sharpened glass. "Justice is the meal." Silence held for a beat. Then Emily exhaled, almost a laugh, almost a sob. "They'll never see you as weak again," she whispered, her voice trembling. Pat didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence carried weight enough. But outside Lisa's office, in the dim glow of the parking lot, Mark leaned against his car, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. His phone buzzed in his palm. A message glowed on the screen. "Meet tonight. I've got a way to turn this around." Mark flicked the cigarette into the gutter, jaw tight, eyes burning with humiliation and rage. He climbed into the car, started the engine, and drove off into the dark. The war wasn't it was spreading. The courthouse buzzed louder than usual. Reporters lingered on the steps, their cameras hungry, their notepads eager. Inside, the air crackled with tension. Pat sat at the plaintiff's table, binders steady before her, Emily beside her with shoulders squared, jaw tight. Across the aisle, Mark tugged at his tie, his face pale and slick with sweat. Diana sat rigid, her lipstick perfect but her hands trembling in her lap. The judge entered, and the room hushed. "The matter of state versus Mark Holloway and Diana Holloway," the clerk intoned. The words fell heavy. State. It was no longer just Pat's fight. It was the law's now. Lisa rose, her posture composed, her voice cutting clean through the silence. "Your Honor, the grand jury has returned indictments against both defendants for fraud, forgery, and aggravated identity theft. We move today to confirm charges and set conditions." Mark's head snapped toward her, his lips parting in disbelief. Diana stared forward, glassy-eyed. The judge nodded to the clerk, who read the charges aloud. Each count sounded like a hammer blow. Fraud, forgery, theft, stacked one on top of the other until the weight pressed the room into stillness. Lisa pressed forward. "In addition, we are filing a motion for restitution. The defendant's actions directly jeopardized Mrs. Holloway's property, her credit, and her financial legacy. It is not enough to punish them. They must pay back what they stole." Diana shifted in her seat, whispering furiously to Mark, but he only shook his head, face red with humiliation. At the prosecution's table, Quinn Rivera rose, a flash drive in hand. "Your Honor, the state has secured new evidence, bank surveillance footage. These clips show Mark submitting refinance paperwork alone, with no sign of Mrs. Holloway present. The timestamps align with forged documents. The evidence is clear." The screen lit up as footage. There was Mark, striding into the bank, handing over papers, leaving again. No Pat, no cosign, just him. Emily's hand clenched on Pat's arm. Her voice trembled with fury. "He lied to everyone." Lisa gave her a subtle nod. "Now, Emily," she whispered. Moments later, Emily rose to testify in a preliminary deposition. Her voice wavered at first, but soon steadied as she told the court what she had witnessed. The threats, the power of attorney confrontation, the recording she had captured in the hallway. Her words cut through the room with youthful conviction, a counterweight to Mark's bitter denial. Robert Lane followed. He carried with him the original notarized document, the forged signatures, the rejected refinance, the certified record. He held them like a priest carrying holy text, his calm voice explaining every detail with precision. "These are original," he said, handing them to the clerk. "I was present for the submission. The signatures attributed to Patricia Holloway are forgery." The judge leafed through the evidence, her brow furrowing deeper. When she finally looked up, her eyes locked on Mark and Diana. "This court finds sufficient cause to proceed to trial. Both defendants are remanded under bond. The charges are serious, and the evidence substantial." Gasps rippled across the gallery. Mark's face drained of all color. Diana gripped his arm so tightly her knuckles whitened, but her expression cracked, fear slipping through for the first time. Emily exhaled in relief. Lisa leaned close to Pat, her voice a whisper meant for her alone. "This is the turning point. From here, they fight uphill." Pat didn't move, didn't break her gaze from the bench. When the gavel came down, she finally let her whisper slip free, soft but laced with iron. They gambled with my house. She closed her binder with a decisive snap. Her eyes flicked toward Mark and Diana, steady and merciless. Now they lose theirs. The gavel echoed once more, sealing the moment. And in that sound, Pat knew the war had tipped irrevocably. The battle was no longer about defending what was hers. It was about taking back everything they had tried to steal. The courtroom was crowded, every bench filled, the air heavy with whispers. Reporters scribbled notes, their pens scratching like insects. Pat sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded on her binder, her face composed. She wore no jewelry, no frills, just quiet dignity that made her look like the very opposite of the caricature about to be. The defense attorney rose, a man with slicked back hair and a voice that oozed false sympathy. He stepped to the center of the room and faced the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, spreading his arms wide, "what we have here is not a crime. What we have is family conflict. A mother, an aging mother, angry at her son and daughter-in-law, lashing out with accusations because she feels left behind." He turned toward Pat, gesturing subtly. "Vindictive, that is the word. Vindictive." Emily bristled, but Lisa placed a calming hand on her arm. The defense attorney pressed on. "Consider this. Patricia Holloway was once the center of this household, but time changes things. Roles shift. She struggled to accept that. And now, rather than letting go gracefully, she has dragged her family into court, desperate to keep control." Pat did not move. She didn't so much as blink. Her stillness made the lawyer's words feel cheap, flimsy against the weight of her composure. Lisa rose slowly, every step deliberate. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to address the..." The judge nodded. Lisa turned to the jury, her voice calm, sharp, precise. "Vindictive? That's the story you're being asked to believe. Let's examine the facts." She gestured toward the clerk. "First, the testimony of Emily Holloway, a young woman with no financial gain in this, no vendetta, only truth." Emily stood, voice trembling at first, then strengthening as she repeated what she had heard, what she had recorded, the threats, the intimidation, the demand for power of attorney. The jury leaned in. Her youth, her raw sincerity, carried weight. Words alone could not. Lisa let the silence settle, then continued. "Second, the record. Mr. Robert Lane, please." Robert stepped forward with his measured calm, holding the originals again. He explained the forgery, the rejected refinance, the notarized in. His authority was quiet but unshakable, each fact a nail in the coffin of doubt. "Third," Lisa said, her voice rising slightly, "the surveillance footage, obtained by investigator Quinn Rivera, presented to this court." The screen flickered to life. There was Mark, entering the bank alone, sliding documents across the counter, leaving minutes later without his mother present. The timestamp glowed in the corner, irrefutable. Lisa let the video play twice, the sound of Mark's pen scratching across paper echoing faintly. Then she clicked it off, letting the silence speak louder than any argument. She turned back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not vindictive. This is evident. This is not a mother clinging to relevance. This is a woman whose name, whose identity, whose life's work was stolen by her own family." The defense attorney leapt to his feet, sputtering, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Counsel, enough theatric. The evidence is substantial. The jury will disregard emotional speculation." Mark's jaw tightened, his face blotched with rage. Diana sat stone still, her knuckles white against her lap, eyes fixed anywhere but the jury. Through it all, Pat remained silent. She didn't gloat, she didn't speak. She sat steady, her dignity more eloquent than any rebuttal. When Lisa returned to her seat, she whispered, "You've already won them." Pat only lifted her eyes toward the jury box. Her silence carried a force words could never match. And as the judge called recess, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs, not of doubt, but of inevitability. Pat folded her hands over her binder once more. The storm raged around her, but she was the still center. The battle wasn't finished, but the momentum had shifted entirely. The courtroom felt heavier when the trial opened, as though the walls themselves were straining under the weight of what was about to unfold. The jury sat in neat rows, 12 strangers bound together by duty, their eyes fixed on the stage where family grievances had hardened into crime. The prosecutor rose first. A tall man with a clipped voice, he approached the jury box with deliberate steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is not about misunderstanding. It is about theft, deliberate, calculated, and cold. The defendant, Mark and Diana Holloway sought to strip Patricia Holloway of her home, her saving, her dignity. They forged signatures. They opened fraudulent accounts. They treated family as prey. Each word landed like a gavel strike. Pat sat motionless, hands folded atop her binder, her eyes fixed on the table before her. When the prosecutor returned to his seat, Lisa Porter rose. She carried the binder to the clerk's table, laying it open with reverence. Page by page, she displayed the forged mortgage files, the fraudulent signature, the paper trail that told a story no smear could erase. "These are not theories," Lisa said evenly. "These are records. Paper does not lie. Paper remembers." She stepped back as Robert Lane was called to Robert took the stand with the calm gravity of a man who had carried this truth too long. He lifted the originals for the court to see, his voice measured. "I notarized Patricia Holloway's authentic signature on multiple. These," he gestured to the forgery, "are not hers. The loop of the P, the slant of the hand, the spacing, all wrong. Anyone familiar with her signature would know instantly." The jury leaned in as he passed the originals to the clerk. The judge studied them briefly, then nodded, unimpressed with the defense's shifting eyes. Next, Emily was. She took the stand with trembling hands, but her voice found its strength. She spoke of nights filled with whispered threats, of the confrontation at the kitchen table, of Diana's hissed warning that accidents are quick. Then she produced her phone. The audio played, Diana's venom filling the courtroom like smoke. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably. One woman shook her head in disgust. Mark muttered something under his breath, his jaw twitching, but it was Diana who cracked. Under cross-examination, Lisa's question came sharp and unrelenting. "Mrs. Holloway, did you authorize accounts under Patricia Holloway's name?" Diana's lips tightened. "No." "Did you use cards tied to those accounts to purchase jewelry, clothing, and vacations?" Her eyes darted toward the jury, then to Mark. She hesitated. I didn't know where the money came from." Lisa pressed forward. "So you admit you used the cards? You just claim ignorance of their origin?" Diana's composure slipped. Her voice rose an octave, strained and defensive. "I didn't forge anything. I just used what Mark gave me." The prosecutor leaned back, satisfied. The jury watched closely, some scribbling notes, others studying her face with skepticism. The performance of calm control had cracked. Now there was only desperation. Pat didn't move. She simply folded her hands tighter, her silence more damning than any word she might have spoken. When court adjourned for the day, the gavel's echo lingered. The jury filed out slowly, their eyes filled not with confusion but with focus, weighing every fact, every slip, every raised voice. Pat rose from her chair, binder clutched to her chest. As the crowd shuffled out, she leaned close to Emily, her voice soft enough to vanish beneath the noise. "Paper speaks louder than blood." Emily shivered, hearing in her grandmother's whisper not bitterness, but prophecy. The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that felt alive, thick with anticipation. Jurors leaned forward, pens idle, eyes sharp. Even the air conditioning seemed to fade as the clerk handed Lisa Porter a slim folder filled with the bank's crest. Lisa set it gently on the evidence. Her voice carried steady, deliberate. "Your Honor, the prosecution submits its final exhibit, the original mortgage statement of the Holloway resident, stamped, dated, and certified." The judge gestured for her to proceed. Lisa opened the folder, unfolding the crisp statement with care. The room tilted as she held it up for the jury to see. Bold at the top, Patricia Holloway. No cosigner, no secondary name, sole owner. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the jurors exchanged glances, the truth plain as daylight. Lisa's voice sliced the silence. "This document predates every forged attempt. It is the original, the only valid ownership record. The Holloway house belongs, fully, legally, and unquestionably, to Patricia Holloway." Mark's chair screeched against the floor as he shot up. "That's not true." His face was crimson, sweat beading along his hairline. That's fake." The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mr. Holloway, sit down or be removed." He dropped back into his chair, muttering furiously, his hands clawing the armrest. Diana stared straight ahead, mascara streaking faintly down her cheek. The last veneer of composure was gone. Lisa handed the document to the clerk. "Your Honor, this obliterates any claim the defendants ever had. The refinances, the forged signature, the fraudulent accounts, every one of them collapses under the weight of this single truth. They tried to steal what was never theirs." The judge nodded gravely. Jury will take this final exhibit into deliberation. The jurors filed out. Minutes stretched into hours, though each tick of the clock felt like a hammer strike. Pat sat motionless, Emily's hand clasped tight around hers. Robert and Quinn murmured in low tones, Lisa calm but watchful. Across the aisle, Mark paced in tight circles while Diana shrank into her chair, pale and rigid. At last, the jury returned. The foreman stood, verdict slip in. His voice was clear, firm, merciless. In the case of State versus Mark and Diana Holloway, guilty on all counts. The words cracked the air like lightning. Diana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the water glasses, but the bailiff's hand on his shoulder pressed him back down. The judge adjusted her glasses, her tone cold as stone. The defendants are hereby convicted of fraud, forgery, and identity theft. Furthermore, in accordance with state law, this court strips both defendants of any claim to inheritance from Patricia Holloway. Restitution shall be pursued to the fullest extent. Mark's head dropped into his hand. Diana wept silently, shoulders shaking. The gallery buzzed with shock, but the jury sat steady, their verdict carried without regret. Emily broke first. Tears spilled as she threw her arms around her grandmother, sobbing in her shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Pat held her tightly, her own eyes damp but steady. She looked past her granddaughter, past Lisa and Robert, past the wreckage of her son and his wife, and fixed her gaze on the oak-paneled walls of the courtroom. Her whisper was so soft it might have been mistaken for breath, yet Emily heard it. So did Lisa, leaning just close enough. "Breakfast is mine again." It wasn't about eggs or coffee or sunlight on the oak. It was about dignity reclaimed, about the seat of power restored, about silencing the mockery that had once poisoned her. The gavel struck once more, final and heavy, sealing the verdict. But Pat didn't rise right away. She sat still, binder in her lap, the courtroom swirling around her. Mark and Diana were led out in cuffs, the crowd pressing closer to glimpse them. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, and Pat, steady as stone, knew this war was over, yet her whisper promised something. She hadn't just won back her house, she had carved her name, unshakable, into the record of justice. The kitchen smelled of bacon and butter, sunlight spilling once more across the oak table. But this time, Pat didn't stand at the stove, fussing with pans and napkins. She sat at the head of the table, her binder resting closed beside her like a crown to its rightful place. Emily moved with practice at the stove, her hair tied back, spatula. The sizzle of eggs filled the room. "Grandma," she said over her shoulder, "you're not cooking today. I've got this." Pat watched her, eyes soft but proud. The roles had shifted, but not with humiliation, with respect. Emily set down a plate in front of her grandmother. Toast stacked neatly, eggs steaming, bacon crisp. "For you," she said, almost ceremonial. Pat picked up her fork, her hand steady, her appetite sharp for the first time in months. She took a bite, savoring not the food itself, but the unspoken promise behind it. Loyalty, love, renewal. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Emily answered, and Martha Caldwell bustled in, cheeks flushed from the autumn air, a paper bag tucked under her arm. "I brought scones," Martha announced, her voice bright. She wrapped Pat in a quick hug, then pulled back to study her face. "You look 10 years younger, Pat. The whole street's talking. Proud of you, every last one of us." Pat allowed herself a small smile. "It wasn't pride that drove me." "Maybe not," Martha said, setting the bag on the counter. "But you showed us all what standing your ground looks." Before Pat could answer, another knock sounded. Lisa Porter stepped in, her heels clicking against the tile. A slim envelope. She placed it on the table before Pat. "Certified copies of the deed," she said. "Your name alone. Untouched. No one will ever question it again." Pat slid the envelope closer, her fingertips resting. "Thank you, Lisa." Lisa inclined her head. Justice did what it was supposed to. For once, she glanced at Emily. "Your testimony helped carry it." Emily blushed faintly, but her shoulders lifted, proud. A moment later, Quinn Rivera arrived, crisp suit, phone still buzzing in his pocket. He set a folder down on the table. "Sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month. Based on the conviction, your son and daughter-in-law are facing years, decades possibly, and restitution will claw back every dollar they..." Emily exhaled, relief in her eyes. Martha crossed herself unconsciously. Lisa only nodded, satisfied, but Pat remained still. She rose slowly from her chair, binder in hand, and walked to the study. The others followed at a respectful distance. She opened the small safe built into the wall, its steel door yawning open with a quiet click. One by one, she placed the key documents, the originals Robert had guarded, the bank statement that sealed the verdict, the certified deeds Lisa had delivered. The binder went last, heavy and worn, the vessel that had carried her through humiliation into vindication. The safe door swung shut, locking with a final turn of the dial. Pat laid her palm flat against the cool steel for a moment, her eyes closing as in prayer. When she turned back, her expression was almost serene. She returned to her chair at the head of the breakfast. Emily slid another piece of toast onto her plate without asking. Martha poured tea. Lisa and Quinn lingered at the edge of the room, watching her reclaim her place not through command, but through quiet inevitability. Pat lifted her cup, steam curling upward, and whispered into the sunlight, "House is mine, peace is mine." The words drifted into the air like incense, binding the kitchen, the table, the home itself to her will. And for the first time in months, the Holloway house. The morning light fell across the oak table, warm and golden, the same light that once revealed cracks in the Holloway family. But now it seemed softer, as though the house itself had shifted, relearning how to breathe. Pat sat at the head of the table, her chair pulled close, posture calm, hands folded lightly on the rim of her coffee cup. She no longer gripped it like a lifeline, she held it as though she had all the time in the world. Emily moved with cheerful ease at the stove, humming faintly as she flipped pancakes. "Blueberry, just how you like them," she said over her shoulder. The skillet hissed, filling the room with the sweet, buttery scent of breakfast. Pat's chest warmed, not just at the food, but at the sight of her granddaughter stepping into the role with pride, not pity. The table filled slowly. Martha Caldwell slipped in through the back door, carrying a small bouquet of fresh flowers from her garden. She arranged them in a vase in the center of the table, her hands fussing until they stood just right. "This table deserves flowers now," she declared. Emily set a plate in front of Pat, piled high with steaming pancakes, crisp bacon, and fresh fruit. She didn't hover or wait for approval. She simply served, confident and proud. Pat poured her own coffee, steady and unhurried. The small clink of spoon against porcelain felt like music, a rhythm restored. A knock at the door announced Lisa Porter. She entered with her briefcase but carried no files, no documents, only a small box of chocolate. "No business today," Lisa said with a smile. "Just congratulations." She leaned down, kissed Pat lightly on the cheek, and added, "You taught them, and the whole town, what justice looks like." Pat inclined her head. "Justice tastes better when shared at the table." Minutes later, Quinn Rivera appeared, fresh from a morning jog, his suit traded for a sweatshirt and sneakers. He didn't linger long, just stepped inside, nodded once at Pat, and said, "You did it." His voice carried quiet respect, the kind one professional gives another. Pat nodded back. No words were needed. They ate together, Emily laughing as she told Martha about school, Lisa recounting a ridiculous story from Quinn sipping coffee he hadn't planned to stay for. The table, once a battlefield, had become a hearth. Pat listened more than she spoke, her eyes sweeping the faces around her, her granddaughter proud, her neighbor loyal, her allies steadfast. She felt a soft pride fill her chest, not the sharp fire of victory, but the deep warmth of peace, reclaimed. For a moment she looked at the scratches on the oak surface, the old ones from years of family, the faint, newer ones from recent months of tense gathering, all of them part of the table's story, none of them enough to break it. She set her cup down gently, let the laughter ripple around her, and whispered into the morning air, her words for the wood and the walls as much as for the people. "This table remembers who owns it." Emily glanced up, catching the whisper, her smile widening with understanding. The sunlight deepened across the table, gilding the plates, the flowers, the steam rising from fresh coffee. "And when the mortgage statement arrived, it didn't take my place, it restored it."